Welcome to Revolution Against Evolution. I'm your host, Doug Sharp.
Your co-host, Rich Gear, here as well. And we have a special guest, very special guest, Dr. Jerry Bergman here. Thanks for being on the show.
Great to be on.
Yep.
Tonight we're going to be talking about evolutionists say the darndest things. If you
and they
remember
do.
The old Art Linkletter show, I remember the kids say the darndest things or something like that. And but we find out that there's a lot of things that evolutionists tell us that are simply nonsense. And I think one of the things that I wanted to do, Jerry has 60 books that he's written. And a couple of them I think I'd like to highlight in this show. And the first one is called Poor Design.
Poor Design, yeah.
And the other one is called Useless Organs.
Useless Organs, yeah.
And I'd like you to tell us a little bit about those two books, why you wrote them, and what they are all about. But there's a lot of things you can quote in those books from the evolutionists themselves that really are a little bit fun to talk about.
Yeah, I'll do the Useless Organs book first.
Okay.
And that is important to me because when I was a evolutionist, I thought, could we indeed prove that evolution is not true? And one way we could do that was take one thing they believe, and I looked in the textbooks, and among the things they believed was that we had about 100 organs that had no function. They're useless. Useless organs, vestigial organs they called them. And I thought if I could find evidence that these had a use, that would then disprove their claim. And so I spent a lot of time in the library looking up information, and I found all of them had not only uses, but many of them had important uses. So indeed, this claim of evolutionists was simply wrong. And this basically opened the door for me to looking at other areas. And the book I wrote called Vestigial Organs Are Fully Functional is the first book I wrote dealing with that. And then I had an interest in that ever since, and I have been doing more research, and that's how I came up with the other book called Useless Organs, showing indeed there are no organs that are useless. They all have important functions. And the evolutionists get around that by saying, well, they're not as useful as they used to be.
Oh,
They
yeah.
had a more important function in the appendix, had a more important function in rabbits or other animals. And therefore, they're not really useless, but they're less useful. And again, I looked in information in this and found that just simply isn't true. In fact, the appendix has 5 known functions, many of them which are very important. And the problem is that historically, when they were seen as useless, many people had them removed for no reason.
Right, yeah.
And the appendix is a good example. My wife mentioned to me that when she, in her first marriage, she had her first, I think, second child, they took out her appendix because, well, it's got to be taken out sometime because it just causes problems because it has no function. So as a result, she doesn't have an appendix, and that has caused certain problems for her. And we know now that appendectomy does cause certain problems. So surgeons nowadays, if they're up with the literature and if they're fluent with what's going on in medicine, nowadays they will do whatever they can to save it. Now, if it is inflamed, if it's burst or could burst, yeah, it has to be removed. But on the other hand, if at all possible, they will do what they can to save it. And that now is the protocol that is accepted by the different medical associations. And so indeed, we have shown pretty clearly, the literature has shown, that all these organs have a use. In fact, many have a very important use. Probably the worst example that they used was the thyroid.
Oh.
The thyroid has no function. It's useless. So they started removing the thyroid from people, and they found certain problems resulted, like a distortion, IQ, facial, etc. distortions occurred.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
That means there are certain cretin diseases, they call it, which is a result of removing your thyroid. And so a doctor about 150 years ago, who was a creationist, by the way, didn't buy the idea that this organ is useless. So what he did was, in some patients, he removed part of the organ. In other patients, he removed the entire organ. And he found in a follow-up that those had the entire organ removed had this problem. And he had one case especially where they were twins. And I'm not sure, now back then, of course, they couldn't probably deal with this by other means. But back then, one girl of the twins had the total one removed, the other had part of it removed. And when he saw them, like 10 years later, what a difference. One girl, perfectly normal, active, intelligent. The other girl, retarded, had odd facial features, etc.
Really?
So this convinced him, just other cases as well, this convinced him that indeed the thyroid has a very important function.
Didn't you have a experience also with your tonsils?
And with my own self, when I was young, I went to the doctor and he said, well, we got to get those tonsils out. And I said, why? What's wrong with them? He said, well, nothing's wrong with them, but it's better to have them out when you're young than to wait and have them out when you're older. And so as a result, I had them out for no reason. And then they grew back. So I had to have them out again, which they sometimes do grow back. Now they recognize that indeed you should do what you can to save the tonsils. And my case, and many cases, they would not have removed them if they used the protocol which is used today. And so, because mine, there's really no reason. Now, obviously, if they become swollen so greatly you can't breathe, yeah, you have to do something. But that's true of many structures. If your hand becomes so swollen beyond a certain point, you may have to have surgery.
Yeah, I always say that. Yeah, you got two hands. Okay, one of them we don't need, so we get rid of it. I mean, no, nobody's going to do that. Even with organs that maybe are not as important in some sense, like the heart or the brain, obviously. But without them, you have problems. But even if you didn't have problems, don't we have systems where we create backup things in case something goes wrong? Then you have something else and can kind of fill in the blank. Or
that is another function of some of these so-called vestigial organs.
Yeah.
That indeed, and of course the spleen is one example, where we have backup organs. If you remove the spleen, then other organs will take over some of the functions.
Okay.
And so indeed it's not totally useless, but pretty much it's clear that his claims, Darwin's claims, and he was the one who started this idea, except he called them rudimentary organs. He didn't call them vestigial organs.
Okay.
But in starting this idea, and he mentioned the same ones that we talk about today. And we realize now that medical experts realize, they should at least, and I say that they should because so many articles, just a couple of months ago, I came across an article which again made the same claims, which have been refuted for decades. We have all these useless organs, they have no function. The appendix, it does nothing. We can take it out without a problem. And the thyroid, we can take it out. And the coccyx, we can take out. And all these other organs we can remove. Pituitary has no function, so if we can, we should remove it as well. And they don't seem to be aware of the current medical literature. And one book I read basically, which covers this, and I wrote a review on Amazon, which basically said, when you write a book about medicine, you have to read, you really should read the literature. You should know what you're talking about. It's not a good idea to write a book if you really don't know what you're talking about. Ooh. And I couldn't believe that they would argue the same things. Some, like the nictitating membrane, they found a function for that in the 20s, 30s, 1928, I believe.
Oh, over 100 years.
So it's been almost a century ago. And it's correct, and basically I use that in several of my books because I couldn't find a better explanation of what it does and why it's there and so on. And therefore, they come out with the literature, it's published in a good journal, and yet people don't follow it. Partially, and I talked to a doctor about this, and he says, look, we have to spend so much time just keeping up with the latest. We can't really start looking at what the nictitating does or doesn't do. We don't have time. And besides, part of the eye, of course.
That would be okay, but then don't write about it then. That's the point. The point of it is, you may not know, and you should keep up as much as you can, but this is a published thing that was coming out with old errors.
Right.
And Doug, that reminds me, we've dealt with for years they deal with the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Yeah.
That was discredited over 100 years ago, and I learned about that when I was in school.
Yeah.
They were still teaching it.
Yeah.
Almost 100 years after it had been discredited.
Yeah, using Haeckel's drawings.
Yeah, Haeckel's drawings. Yeah.
No less.
The problem is you have to read, and so many people don't. I at least send my articles to 3 reviewers, sometimes 4, and I want to find out, am I missing something? Is there some study, am I making a mistake? And even the 4th person I send the article to says, well, this isn't quite clear. You got to explain it this way. It's not quite, you're slightly misleading people. Let's be clear and let's explain it this way. And so you need reviewers who can go through it, who can analyze what you have to say and point out that maybe it's not quite right. And maybe you need to tweak it. In my case, mostly tweaking things. But on the other hand, I said some things which could be seen as misleading. But fortunately, that's why I sent it to reviewers. They caught it and said, now they could interpret this another way. And you got to make it clear what you're trying to say. And so then I can clarify it, that they can help me do that where I can't. You know, it's hard to prove your own work.
Yeah.
It's hard to judge your own work because all the work I do, I think everything is wonderful. Everything
of course,
is great.
yeah.
It's great. So
I think
you
it's pretty
need
good myself.
critics.
Yeah.
And
But-
if people criticize the article and send it back and say it's a perfect article, I don't send it back to them because it's not a perfect article. It can't be a perfect article. Nothing I wrote has been a perfect article. So I need people that scrutinize it and find something wrong because there is something wrong, even if it's clarification.
Yeah,
And
there's,
then I can fix
something I said on, posted on Facebook, do not despise the refining that the Lord has for you.
Yeah.
Because there's, we are all, none of us are perfect, and our work isn't perfect, and there's always something that can be improved when to have people look at.
That's true.
But the thing is gets me is that some, like the article you just mentioned and other things that keep getting written because they are the dominant paradigm. They can get away with sloppy writing, but the propaganda works.
Yeah.
That's the problem with it. The propaganda gets a lot of people persuaded the wrong way, and they keep mouthing the same miscued arguments. You don't have that luxury.
No,
you
no,
you
I
don't.
No.
And nor do you want the luxury. That keeps you lean and mean.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Maybe not mean, but ready to go.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of important in some respects because that's how I think people really slide into not only just error but really wrong-headed ideas that really can influence and destroy lives. People in so many different ways. I still remember the time reading about how Washington was bled to death, and they had knowledge of things that, they said, we this was the knowledge we had at the time, so we're justified. I said, not to my way of thinking, because the information was out at that time that doing what they did was wrong, and they still did it. And that's what I think a lot of these people who promote these ideas long after they've been disproven continue to have an upper hand as long as people still want to go there. I think it's good that you do what you're doing, going through 4 review and making sure as much as possible, humanly possible, is to make it as clear and accurate as possible.
And I'd like to get some evolutionists to review it, but they say, no, I don't want to bother. Because you're obviously wrong, so why should I read it? Well,
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
it's frustrating because I really need critics to read it because if something's wrong, they'll find it and let me know. And at least they could find maybe not as clear as I could be. But on the other hand, I've been unable to get evolutionists to read my stuff. They're just not interested. I don't want to waste my time. I've got too much time I have to spend on my own stuff. Well, that's not really true, but that's what excuse they give.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. The evolution paradigm is accepted. The vestigial organ fits. It's been used for 200 years since Darwin came up with this in 1859. So it's been used for a long time, so it fits. And how many people really have looked at the other side and know that this argument is not any good? And my creationist friends say, wait a minute, come on. Nobody accepts this today. Why are you writing articles and books about something which evolutionists don't accept? Well, the fact is they do. And I come up with articles that are a month, 2, 3, 6, 8 months old, which they make the same arguments that all these organs have no use or less use, they're vestigial, they're rudimentary, etc. So so many still use that same argument.
See, I was not aware of that myself. I just figured they switched. They did what I call a bait and switch. So they went from the vestigial organs to junk DNA. They just kind of made it a little smaller in scope. And since you can obviously disprove vestigial organs, you can go in and say, well, this this functions this way, this does this, this has this system, this is, but DNA but even that's becoming an obsolete argument.
Yeah.
From what I can read with the stuff I've read, that some of the DNA, even though it's not protein, coding, or it has different functions.
Yeah.
But it's definitely not junk. It's not leftover vestigial DNA.
Vestigial.
Yeah.
I cover that and how important that was in my growth from an evolutionist to a Christian.
Oh yeah.
In this book here, I have a section on how important that was.
The book is called Cancel 310.
Yeah. So Jerry's latest book.
And we'll have that available on rae.org pretty soon. So, I also wanted to talk about Kettlewell's experiment with peppered moss, which he ended up pinning on the tree that he wanted to show the difference of them and to show the evolution. So he didn't go search the woods to find two different moths on the same tree and then take a picture of them. He pinned them there. But the whole peppered moth thing, you want to say something about that?
He would say you can't wait forever for them to land on the side of the tree. So, you got a time factor. So you get a moth, you pin them on the tree, you get a picture. So he would say he's just trying to photograph what happens, but it just doesn't happen while he was there because he doesn't want to sit around for 6 months to wait till it happens.
Yeah.
Well, not 6 months, but he doesn't want to sit around for 2 or 3 days.
But it gives the impression that that's what he ended up doing. But
right.
But the whole argument that he's using is something that really has been disproven anyway, because you have the two different varieties. And you have a more, there's no evolution going on here at all.
Right.
No change. You just have a light version and a dark version.
Right.
And you get more of them when there's smoke and of the
pollution.
Trees polluted, they become darker, and therefore the darker moths are more apt to survive. So they increase in number. The lighter moths are less apt to survive because of the pollution. You clean the pollution up, the trees are a lot lighter, and therefore the light, it changes. The dark animals are more likely to be moths, like to be eaten by birds, and the lighter ones are more likely to survive.
Creationists have never had a problem with that anyway. I don't, I've never even, I looked at that and I go, that's your best evidence for macroevolution? I don't understand this at all, because I don't have a problem with light and dark colored thing, in environment will affect things.
It's the impression that they give. That's the darndest thing that they're saying. Is that they are implying that this is something that's affecting a change, and it really isn't.
Yeah,
it's only change in population.
And maybe creationists aren't critical enough. Maybe they should examine articles which really are not that useful for evolutionists. And so maybe some of the arguments they use now are not that helpful, but a little bit helpful. And if we analyze them, we might find they're not even a little bit helpful.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
To the evolutionary worldview.
But it takes a special kind of a person to do that kind of stuff. You're the guy.
Yeah.
No, you're not the only guy, but there's a lot of people that why is this even important? And we've done a show for a long time over this very issue. Why is it important? And the issue is, were you made by a creator, or did you randomly just come by chance in random accidents to be who we are now? This is a whole worldview type of idea, and what we do here, Doug and I, we try to remove obstacles to faith, and I think that's really what it amounts to, because faith is not blind for the most part. There's a reason to it, and at your point with the vestigial organs, which are not, is that everything has got a function. The designer designed.
Yeah.
And even in a cursed, fallen world, he has not removed all of his blessing from us.
You still see that design?
Yes, we still see that design.
I have a whole book which I titled Science is the Doorway to Christianity. And I show that indeed many people, including myself, become Christians as a result of studying the natural world. You learn about an artist, by studying your artwork. So I studied your artwork today at the museum, and I learned a lot about you. And therefore you study God's creation, and you learn about God, a lot about God, by studying His creation. And I learned some things I didn't know about you.
Oh.
How careful you were in making a drawing, that you consulted the Indians.
Oh, yeah.
Make sure this is accurate.
Oh.
And the Indian would say, nope, we never played this game. We played another game. And so you had to tweak the paintings because you wanted to be accurate in your depiction of the Indians from Michigan.
Yeah, there were 12 tribes that I had to consult. And they didn't always agree with each other either.
Yeah.
So we tried to.
And so I didn't know that about you.
Yeah.
So by studying the painting that you did, I learned about you.
Oh, that's, yeah, you would.
And by studying the creation, the body, in my case, studying anatomy, I learned a lot about the Creator.
Interesting. That's a good way to put
what
that.
I find interesting is your book called Poor Design. And I remember getting an email one time from a fellow talking about the left recurrent laryngeal nerve in the giraffe.
Yes.
And it goes all the way from the brain, all the way down to the bottom of the spine and comes back up to connect to the bottom of the voice box of the giraffe.
Right.
And he says, that's a poor design. Why don't you just connect it right over here, you know? And I asked him, well, since you're a much better designer than God, apparently, why don't you go and do an experiment and surgically shorten that nerve and see what happens? Maybe the giraffe can sing.
Well, there's several reasons for that long design. Number one, it starts out in a certain place, and the neck grows, and the nerves in this case blood vessels have to grow with it. Yeah. So you got to have some way of getting the nerves up there, even though it's quite a ways when it's an adult. But when it's very young, it's not much distance. Also, timing is important because the length of that nerve is important so that the message gets to in this case, the voice box at the right time, considering other organs in that area. So it's a matter of timing. It's a clock in some ways. It's a timing so that the message gets there at the voice box at the right time. Because you have to coordinate a whole bunch of things there.
And while it grows, you know, that's the whole thing. Suppose your automobiles work that way, you know, it grows from a little piece of dust, and all of a sudden this automatically starts to materialize and grow tires and headlights and everything. That's the type of thing that we have going on with in life, is that starts out the microscopic level and grows throughout that way, keeping alive throughout that process. And a lot of things could go wrong if it wasn't perfectly designed.
Yeah, that's true. And it has to work from day one to when you die. The whole system has to work. So during each stage of development, obviously it has to function so that the organism can stay alive.
Yeah, that's to me the genius of it when you think about it, really, yeah. But
so you wrote these books. What are the reasons why you wrote those two books?
I have an interest in biology, anatomy. I taught anatomy at the medical school and at colleges for 30 years, and therefore when these issues were raised by evolutionists, I thought, that doesn't make sense, that's not right. Although I must state, all the anatomy books I used, none of them made a claim of vestigial organs, none of them, because I checked. And I reviewed a lot of anatomy books for my classes to decide which one to use to teach that class. And I looked for the word vestigial, it wasn't in any of them. I looked for claims, the appendix, for example. Is the appendix vestigial? None of them mention any of these claims were vestigial. Any of these organs were vestigial. And therefore, anatomists know they all are there for a purpose. But obviously biologists don't. And this is my grandson. His biology book said we had all these organs that are useless, including the appendix, a new book, biology book. His anatomy book for the appendix talked about the different functions. So the biologist didn't know what he's talking about.
Oh my God.
And the anatomist did. So the problem is biologists write biology books and include anatomy, and that is a mistake, at least in some cases.
So I think most people think anatomies and biologists would be interfaced enough to know it.
Well, but not many biologists, their focus is on anatomy of human anatomy. Biologists tend to study things like worms and mollusks and entomologists, and so they study a wide variety of biological areas, but they generally don't focus much on human anatomy. If they did, they'd be in another program. studying human anatomy.
You were talking to me before the show about the septum here or whatever.
Right, this
little piece in here, which they say people have claimed that's vestigial.
which has no function. And I found a number of functions. One is the muscles have to be connected around that, go around the lips, have to be connected somewhere. And they go around here and they're connected right here at these spots that stick up a little bit.
Oh.
And that's a connecting point. And also, as I was talking to you about, if you look at an attractive woman, remove all of that, remove the changes, and she is not going to look nearly as attractive. Because attractive women, this little spot here is an important part of their attractiveness. In fact, actually, women who want to look better, a surgical operation will enlarge in this and make it look larger.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Several things they can do too, which are popular among women.
Wow, I did not know. Did not know.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it got me dumbfounded there, and people know me. I'm usually not at a loss for words, Jerry. But I go, wow, I never heard that. So wow,
And that's why I want you to work with me on it, so we can get some good. I tried to draw some drawings of this and how it was connected, but the magazine said too amateurish.
Oh.
So I want a professional to do a really good job, so I can show indeed that this part. And because I don't know any creationists that looked at this being vestigial or not vestigial. And yet some evolutionists claim this is a useless organ here. This has no function. And I thought it must have a function. And indeed, I found it does have a function. And that's why I think the creation journals will welcome that, because you'll find even this little bump here has a function. In the little valley here, and the two bumps on each side has a function.
really.
It's there
What
for a
about
purpose.
Darwin's point on the?
Oh, I've done, that little point here that most people don't have it, and we evolved from foxes and other animals that had a pointed ear, and the ear flipped in, and that point is as a result of flipping in from when we were a fox.
Well, I thought that's
Or some other animal.
I thought that's when we were elves,
Yeah.
But
Yes, we were elves. I'm sorry.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
Lord of the Rings. How do you get Lord of the Rings thing in there somewhere, but yeah. So
I've already done 2 or 3 articles on that. That's no
have you really? Oh, okay.
no question. But Darwin talked about that. In fact, I used the illustration from his book to illustrate my article.
Well, the thing is, what I'm fascinated with, you're looking at things. Creationists have, by and large, looked at things that evolutionists won't even look at anymore.
Right.
And they think the argument's settled, and it's not by any stretch of the imagination. But creationists are finding things. This does not deal with vestigial organs, but what you're doing with vestigial organs. But I think and I'm not going to go off on a big tangent right now. We only got a minute left. But we look for carbon-14 in supposed millions of years old. Evolutionists would never look for it.
Yeah.
We look for different things that they will never look for.
Yeah.
Because it can't be true.
Yeah.
And suddenly we find out that it is true because we just basically bother to look for it.
Yeah.
Same thing with you looking for vestigial organ functions. Although other people have done that too, but you've been an exhaustive list of it.
Yeah. Others have found their vestigial by accident, realizing if you remove it, you got a problem.
Yes.
And maybe this is not vestigial. So I don't know many scientists that tried to find a function for these organs. Some might have, but by and large, they just realized, after some experiments, the one I mentioned earlier, that indeed this organ has a function. It's not useless.
Well, thank you for being on our show tonight, Jerry. We appreciate everything that you're doing, and we'll see you next time on Revolution Against Evolution.
Okay.